The opportunities that show up during brain development has to do with the stages in which the baby, after the baby comes out of the womb, he has different stages in his development. The brain is a project in progress. The activity intensifies in the first few years, as I mentioned, continues in infancy and adolescent years, and reaches maturity in adulthood. The times of growth are intense in childhood and adolescence, and some circuits are more sensible at different times. I'm going to use a model that was created by Dr. Daniel Siegel for you to understand how this process of growth is done over time. The brain, if you took, is called the hand model of the brain. If you took your hand and you to put it that way, you'll notice that this is the spinal cord. The spinal cord is where we have all of the basic functions of our body: motor skills, gross motor, fine motor, heart palpitation, blood pressure. So it's the part of the brain that is controlled automatic, the rates of the heart and all of that. The second part, the first part of the brain that develops is this part of the brain, the more primitive part of the brain, which is tied up with the animal kingdoms. We're animal, we're part of that kingdom. So the animal piece, where the responses has to do with protection, growth, and continuation of the species. And that is the oldest brain, billions of years of that brain. So all of the instinctual responses are here: fight or flight or freeze, when that individual as an entity is being put in situational stress or it's attacked. And then the second part that develops, which comes into the first few years of that individual's life, is the emotional brain. And the emotional brain is represented by the thumb. And this is where wiring occurs. And it could be a functional wiring and everything is into place, or it could be dysfunctional and the child is going to need to work on it, because that determines the way he responds. The child is mostly developing the emotional brain. As the time goes, if you look at the brain like that, the cortex, the neocortex, the newest part of the brain, covers all of that. And if you were to think about this, it will be your eyes, and this is the frontal lobe. This is a part of the brain where we have the higher thinking, the more evolved thinking, so we can manage our emotional function, the primitive part of the brain, and all of the rest. So your job initially with your baby comes at this level. And when your baby reaches around 5 or 6 years old, he begins to do some decisions that has to do with his way, based on what was created here, his way of looking at life. So the times of growth are intense in childhood, has to do with the emotional part of the brain, the limbic part of the brain, and those circuits become sensitive for the rest of the period that brain is going to grow. So in order for that brain to grow, the most important piece, the fundamental piece for that brain to grow, is the relationship with the external world. And that relationship is balanced, managed in all aspects by that external person, by that caregiver, by the person that the child is creating, what we call the attachment. During the ages of 0 to 10, the number of connections that the brain forms are in the trillions. Because at that time, when the child is growing, he doesn't have categories. He's unable to say, okay, all of those people belong to a category that is my family. All of these other ones belong to a category of a stranger. At one point in that 0 to 10 period, you said, oh, I just have a family category. I don't have to have memory for each one of them. These all belong to one category. Many of this extra connection, he prunes them away, he gets rid of them, and they eliminate the connection that are seldom or never used. So then start creating categories, start creating leads. So the brain, from trillions of connections, starts shrinking to a normal size. The connection starts shrinking until the child can identify, this is unknown, this is no, this is an animal, this is a bird, not everything has a full connection. They belong to a category, they belong to a part. So connections that are reinforced, the child keeps, and connections that don't help them, the child's pruned away. That's a normal process again, but it has to do with the relationship of that child with the external world. Language acquisition, here's a very important message. Children can learn any language only by being exposed to that language during the language window opportunity. And they can learn those languages simultaneously. If one of the parents speak Spanish, the other speak English, or the other speak Russian, or whatever language, if you give it that information, it will be logged as a right with the right sounds. And that language acquisition part of the brain begins to shut down closer to the age of 5. It doesn't mean that he cannot learn language later, but it will be easier for him or her to identify the sounds that are related to that language, the actual sounds. Later on in life, especially when you become an adult, you have to learn to mimic the sound, but you're never going to have the actual sound because your language acquisition aspect of it was logged much early in your development. So if the child introduces, for example, language later in life, that language will be spoken with a foreign accent, will be able to speak it, but it will not have the original sounds. That's why it's very hard, for example, somebody with an adult from another country that has very hard sounds and is not able to learn soft sounds that are particularly important for other language. So the accent will always be there. He may manage very well the anatomy of the language, the grammar, the consonants, the acquisition of how to build a communication, but he's unable to actually create the proper sound or the actual sound where that language came from. What happened when there are problems during the construction period of that brain? Yes, we can correct it. But it is better and more economic to establish a solid foundation at the onset of life and not to have to rewire the circuits of the brain at a later time. Our brain is malleable. We can change connection, we can create connection, we can let go the energy of memories from the past, or else we wouldn't be able to explain how as an adult we can change our life by changing the way we think or by changing the way we wire the connection between the brain and our body. It's called self-directed neuroplasticity. We all can do that, but when we become adult, it's work because we need to erase or we need to take the energy away from past learning experiences and to create new ones in our path. For example, the responses that we have to life or to other people, it's influenced by the environment and it comes from what I learned in my relationship with my primary caregivers. So that created a foundation. If that foundation is limited or it's dysfunctional, that's the way I'm going to create my relationship as an adult over time. I want you to see, just out of curiosity, how the neuronal growth of a child happened. Number one, in the first, at birth, you can see very little structure there, very little number of neuronal connection within the 2 and 3 months, and then later within a couple of years. It's a huge growth, and that growth is going to create the basics for any learning that happened on that child at a later time. Why it's important that we pay attention of those periods of time in our child? Because the studies of genetics have demonstrated that relationships are the basics of that stability of our genetics. The concept of epigenetics, there's something above the gene that can change the structure of the gene, and that programming for that gene respond to experiences as soon as the baby is born in early stages of development. the experience of that baby can trigger structural changes at the genetic level and can open or close genetic expression. Studies in genetics have demonstrated that, for example, abuse and negligence in a child, in the infants, has a very strong influence in the copy of that gene over time, and has a side information. Every gene, every strand of the gene, when they copy, they have a protected end at each end that are called telomeres. Telomeres, telomere. And those telomere, when a child is under the influence of negligence, abuse, malnourishment, those telomeres shorten. So that means that the exposure of that DNA is much more at risk to copy, to have a faulty copy or not to copy right, because that individual created a shortened telomere and is no longer safe to create that copy. It is important to understand that relationship and the way that we program our child, or we create that bonding with our child for the child to learn about relationship, is going to affect the child till the day he dies. So it's not just, oh, I can fix it, I can do that. You can, but it's not the same if you do it right on the first time.